Hey everyone, last endgame tier list update video, at least for this season, unless I plan on making like a build tier list video or like some sort of exotic armor tier list video. A lot of you guys have been asking for that, but for now, we'll probably just go back to making normal, like topical videos after this, which I'm very excited to do. I have a lot of video ideas for this season, and I actually do have some time left this season, so unlike last season where I spent like a really long time making these, hopefully this season will turn out a bit better. So regardless, I went ahead and I went over every single exotic weapon. I redid the entire tier list, so I deleted all these cells, and with the help of chat and some of my friends, we went over every single exotic weapon in the game. And if you guys are not familiar with how we do the exotic weapon tier list here, we split endgame content into 6 separate sections. We have solo content, so solo dungeons, solo lost sectors. We have GMs, I'm more thinking fire team GMs here. We have DPS, so raid and dungeon DPS specifically. We have day 1 content, so more survivability, kind of pressure focused environments. We have challenge content, so maybe solo challenges like, solo Templar, solo raid, stuff like that, or low mans. And then we have speedruns, which are kind of like a separate thing on their own, right? And then we go to every single exotic weapon, we rate them, we give them a score, either optimal, viable, situational, or wasted in that type of content. And based on these scores, we use them as a rough guideline to determine what goes into which tier. So on top of that, I heard your feedback last season loud and clear on weapons like Graviton Lance and Khvostov. I reevaluated them based on what tier they were in, and so I'm excited to present to you guys a little changelog of what happened from between this season and last season. And there's also a couple new exotic weapons that I didn't cover, for example, Choir, and this season's Alethonym and Icebreaker. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and visit the changelog. Let's scroll all the way down to exotic weapons. I'm not going to read through all of them, and that's because some of these changes are kind of a result of blanket changes, and some exotics people just don't care about. So I'm just going to talk about the hits. So before we get started, first I do want to talk about something. We go ahead and scroll down here. You'll notice that compared to last season, there is now a G tier. And the reason for that is similar to with perks and origin traits. I wanted to make the upper tiers more precise, more stringent in their requirements. And so that required me to split F tier into F and G tier. G tier is really like the PvP only stuff, or like really just no completely wasted use in PvE. Whereas F tier, there may be some value in using this weapon, even though it's super niche, super out of the way. Maybe there's better alternatives. So more precise A and E tiers, and F tier has been split into F and G tier. Anything that stayed in F is somewhat beneficial in PvE, and then again, like I said, G tier is PvP only or just straight up bad. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and go to the changelog. So I'm just going to read from my kind of notepad on the side here, where I've listed what I think are the exotics people care about, or the significant and interesting changes that I made this season to the tier list. So first we have Arbalest. Arbalest I think is completely overshadowed by Ariana's Vow now. It generally hasn't been very good. It's kind of overshadowed by Wishender to begin with, and even when it's not overshadowed by Wishender, it has a charge time. Its damage profile is not that great. Even against champs, it's been nerfed. It is just not as dominant as it used to be in a sandbox where we have ready access to Radiant and artifact mods that give special weapons one-shot capability without using your exotic slot for barrier champions. Bad Juju had its explosion frequency buffed heavily, so I moved it into the D tier from the E tier. Bastion, I think I overrated its general usefulness in endgame content, and with the +5 changes, even in speedrunning, it's not used as often as it used to be, so I moved it down 2 tiers into the E tier. Buried Bloodline, I think I underrated this before, but Universal Devour access is great on stuff like Prismatic Titan, for example, and after the legendary Rocket Sidearm nerf, this Rocket Sidearm looks a little better than the others because it has great ammo reserves, given that it's an exotic and it was changed kind of differently compared to regular Rocket Sidearm, so its reserves still look really good. Cloudstrike, I moved it from B to C tier. I think I overrated its general damage potential a little too much. Cloudstrike is still a sniper at the end of the day, and snipers are still a little niche when it comes to general DPS, and there are often a lot of other weapons that you might want to use, like exotic heavies, just for your day-to-day endgame content. Cloudstrike is really more of like a range day 1 option, more so than anything, and I think I didn't accurately represent that by putting it in the B tier. Deterministic Chaos, weaken on hit is less relevant than ever. We have Withering Gaze, which is essentially Deterministic Chaos in legendary weapon perk form, which is on plenty different weapons, not just, heavy weapons too. You don't need to use a machine gun to get weaken on hit. And of course, with Prismatic being as prevalent as it is, Prismatic already has plenty of access to weaken, and of course, that's not even accounting for artifact mod weakens that we pretty much have every season that are pretty easy to use. Dragon's Breath right under that. I think Dragon's Breath is a little too build dependent for a relatively mediocre effect, even if you account for the fact that Dragon's Breath can get like triple quad ignitions even if you place it very carefully on a very large boss. It's still not super consistent in its damage, and its total damage is really nothing to write home about, and the fact that you need to ignite consistently to get the reload makes it so that you kind of have to fill your damage rotation with other special weapons or other abilities to, you know, kind of proc those ignitions faster. And even with all that effort, we damage tested this thing last season. I didn't publish the results, but let me just tell you, they were not as impressive as I was hoping for. Gjallarhorn is much less relevant compared to what it used to be. In previous seasons, this was like an S tier exotic. Last season, we had it at an A tier, and I've even moved it down to a B tier now. Gally used to be really good because it was really versatile. You could use it for ad clear and stuff like GMs, and you could use it for, you know, DPS on raid and dungeon bosses. These days, people don't really use it for either. In the ad clear meta, it's kind of just use prismatic, and for the damage meta, it's kind of just use heavy gels. And so Gjallarhorn has been shifted out of the meta. Plus, obviously, the damage bonus is like 26.4%, which mathematically speaking is really only relevant in like 6-man content. So I would say Gally is just not as relevant as it used to be. Not a game-changing exotic for sure. Next up, we have Graviton Lance, which I moved up a tier. I think C tier was a little bit too low for this thing. I think a lot of people were commenting that, you know, 2 tiers below Sunshot's a little too much. Obviously, Sunshot is better than Graviton in endgame content for a variety of reasons. Hand cannons have a more preferable damage profile in terms of range engagement as well, and explosive payload, you know, weapon stagger, stuff like that. Sunshot obviously feels like a much more consistent weapon as well, but I think 2 tiers of separation was like a little bit too much between Sunshot and Graviton, which is why I moved it up 1 tier. Next up, we have Khvostov, exotic Khvostov. Just a kinetic on-hit ad clear option in Graviton tier. Basically, a lot of these exotic weapons that I didn't understand very well, I just like took them into a Master Law sector this season and I gave them a spin, and I thought Khvostov was, you know, it's pretty decent. And in endgame content, obviously, we like to value on-hit weapons over on-kill weapons, Khvostov being one of those options. The only problem I have with Khvostov is it is a bit of a committal playstyle, like I've said before, where you need to really commit to using the weapon, but I don't think it really should be held against it as much as some other exotic weapons like Hierarchy of Needs. So Khvostov, just a decent kinetic on-hit ad clear option, and I put it in the same tier as Graviton, which is why it's in the B tier. Legend of Acrius, I think it's a little overrated last season because it's a little niche. When it comes to melee damage, even in melee damage situations, there are maybe other exotics that you might want to consider over Acrius. And while Acrius is pretty good, the DPS is very high if you're willing to do like the whole reload shot canceling thing. I still think it was a little overrated in the same way that Cloudstrike was. I think its usability is a little less universal than I gave it credit for by putting it in the B tier. Now, Leviathan's Breath has jumped up 2 tiers from D to B tier here, and that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, it obviously got a reserve buff from 15 to 18 shots, and number 2, it's one of these weapons, exotic weapons, where you don't need reserve mods to really make the best use of getting its maximum total damage. And so its total damage is pretty impressive. At 0 reserves, you get 16 shots. At 1 reserve mod, you get 18 shots, and then with 2 or 3, you get the same amount as 1 reserve mod, which means you only need to run 1 void reserve in order to get this thing to its max total damage, something that a lot of other exotic weapons have trouble with, especially given that in most endgame content, you don't want to be running more than maybe 1 reserve mod in order to keep your resist mod count intact. Next up, we have a pair of exotics. I'm talking about Lumina and Edge of Action, of course, and the reason why both of these have dropped 1 tier, you can see in the comments here, it's just overshadowed a little by No Hesitation. Obviously, Lumina still has some use in speedrun for like Lumina grappling, and it's still a consistent way to provide a 35% buff to your teammates if you don't have access to something like Well or Radiant in something like a dungeon, but it's still overshadowed a little bit by No Hesitation, which is why I dropped it 1 tier. It's just not as fundamentally important as the stuff in B tier. Malfeasance has dropped 2 tiers because of the Lucky Pants nerf. It got hit pretty hard as a DPS strategy. Even against taken enemies, it's not superbly great like it used to be. I did make some mistakes when I was doing my calculations of Lucky Pants this season. I accidentally accounted for Vorpal for 225 RPM or Heavy Burst hand cannons when I was doing my math. So Malfeasance is still worse than something like Warden's Law with Vorpal, but it's not by as much as I initially predicted. That being said, it's still an E tier weapon, and part of the reason is because of another exotic hand cannon which was buffed this season, which is excellent with Lucky Pants, which we'll talk about as we move down the list here. As you can see, it's coming up. Merciless, I think it's extremely niche. I think Choir these days is significantly better for a mid-range exotic special weapon that is, going to do a good amount of burst damage. I think anywhere you would use Merciless in the past for DPS, I think Choir is just generally better even after its nerf, and so that's why Merciless has moved down 2 tiers. I think it's also just extremely niche. Even if Choir didn't exist, Merciless would still be an extremely niche weapon in my opinion. Necrochasm. A lot of people were saying Necrochasm didn't deserve its incredibly low placement, and after using it in some, Master Law sectors and talking with some people in the community, I think Necrochasm, it's not deserving of being in the same tier as something like maybe a Graviton or a Khvostov, especially because in endgame content and some of the ranges that you're playing at, the auto rifle archetype that it is doesn't really have the greatest time getting precision kills. However, I think it's still underrated. Its effect trigger difficulty is not as high as I initially placed it, and so even in high level content, the splash damage is pretty good. One for Thrall is a great exotic perk as well. So I'm kind of a fan of Necrochasm. I'm not going to place it too high, but I think C tier is a much better placement for it, especially given what the tier list looks like this season, which is something I'll talk about at the end of the video. Outbreak has also moved up 1 tier this season, and that's because last season I did some damage testing with this exotic, and needless to say, I was very impressed with both its super and transcendence generation capabilities, as well as its actual DPS being fairly decent even for solo, compared to some of the other easy DPS options like Thunderlord. And so Outbreak, I think on something like a day 1, is a great way of padding your damage without expending pretty much any heavy ammo whatsoever. So pretty impressed with Outbreak. Its ad clear potential I still think is pretty overrated by most people, but I do think for DPS and just being a general utility exotic in the sense that I just described, it was a little bit underrated last season, so I did decide to move it up 1 tier. Parasite, I've also moved up 1 tier. It's kind of just very versatile. It's like the definition of an A tier exotic. It's excellent with holsters. It's great with sustaining and augmenting ability damage builds. It's just great overall. You can use it in DPS, you can use it in roam content. Just like a big fan of Parasite this season. Performed very well in this last contest, day 1. And yeah, Parasite, big fan of the weapon. Next up, we have Red Death Reformed. Red Death Reformed, the biggest problem with it is for an exotic special, it has no splash damage, and I feel like the sustain that it provides is kind of unnecessary. We already have a lot of sustain built into even legendary weapon perks and stuff like Buried Bloodline, as well as our subclasses, so Red Death Reformed's kind of sustain is not super necessary, and the general understanding of what a good exotic primary does these days is definitely more splash-oriented than kind of single-target sustain-oriented, so that's why I decided to move it down 2 tiers, because even the stuff in the E tier has a lot more relevance in endgame PvE than something like Red Death Reformed. Now, Still Hunt has actually dropped 3 tiers from S to C tier, and that's for 2 reasons, as you can see here. First, I didn't touch the exotic weapon tier list since before it got nerfed, so obviously it got a huge nerf with Celestial Nighthawk. And second, we are in a meta that has moved more towards exotic heavy focus for casual kind of endgame gameplay, and for more specific and precise speedrun damage rotations, even there we're moving more towards heavy DPS dumping. And so Still Hunt is really kind of just used as like a Fourth Horseman, where like your first burst you get it off, except Fourth Horseman can be reloaded with stuff like Impetus, and then you have that burst again. Still Hunt, the only way to get your entire burst back is by somehow rallying again, picking up 12 orbs, or sitting through the incredibly long kind of 5 or 6 90 RPM sniper shots that are not really buffed by anything. And so as a result, I do think Still Hunt has really lost its niche rather significantly, because before it was on one end of this balancing equation where like, yes, the 90 RPM shots of just shooting this Still Hunt sniper over and over again were worth it because that Nighthawk shot that you got was mathematically worth the payoff. These days on Warlock and Titan, I think this exotic is, I mean, it hasn't really changed, right? It didn't get nerfed on Warlock and Titan, but just completely dead in the water in my opinion. And then even on Hunter, it's rather niche, right? Because you're either using it and a heavy weapon, and then you're kind of sacrificing the ability of your other special weapons to work because you're spending so much time on this 90 RPM sniper trying to get that shot off again, and you're also spending time away from your heavy weapon when we have these really strong exotic heavies, when we have these really strong legendary heavies in the form of like VS Chill Inhibitor and Bittersweet this season. And so I think Still Hunt is in a really awkward position. It's basically just range burst damage, which is like higher than Izzy, but less refreshable than Izzy, and then you can't use an exotic heavy weapon for burst or an exotic heavy weapon for sustained either. So just by definition, I kind of looked at the other weapons in the same tier as Still Hunt, like Cloudstrike, and I was like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of about the same level of niche. If you look at the difference between Still Hunt and Cloudstrike in my boss DPS spreadsheet, they have essentially the same DPS value, and Cloudstrike actually edges it out slightly when it comes to total damage, and you have to put in a lot more effort on Celestial Nighthawk Still Hunt in order to yield these results as well. And so I kind of have to stay. Stillhunt and Cloudstrike are about the same amount of niche these days, as much as it pains me to say that, because post-nerf, you know, that kind of balancing equation where you're just kind of spending so much time shooting 90 RPM snipers is just really not worth it, in my opinion, in most content these days, outside of like some rare speedrunning cases. Fourth Horseman, I've also moved down one tier from B to C tier. It's just less relevant due to the Choir of One release. Choir of One does a lot of what the Fourth Horseman does, except for it doesn't really struggle from ammo issues as much, and it doesn't have as punishing of a reload time as Fourth Horseman either. The Last Word has moved up from F to E tier. It got a huge buff in PvE, and Bungie didn't revert it. Okay, they kind of buffed it by accident this past season. And so, yeah, for Lucky Pants damage, I mean, obviously for neutral gameplay, Malfeasance is still much better. It has intrinsic unstop, does more damage to taken, etc., etc. But the Last Word, you know, if you want to use it in a damage rotation, I put it in the E tier instead of in the F tier, because I'm going to make some damage rotations with the Last Word, and it does look pretty promising. So happy about that. The Navigator, I've moved from A to B tier. It's much less relevant after the grapple melee nerfs. People don't tend to do grapple melee damage as much, and when it comes to giving your teammates, you know, woven mail or kind of severing a boss, it is helpful in that regard in some cases, but still a pretty niche use case. And given what's happened to the rest of the tier list, which again I'll talk about at the end of this video, I think it being in the B tier is not a huge deal. B tier is where a lot of decent exotics reside. I just don't think it's as good as the other A tier exotics this season. Prospector got a huge damage profile rework. If you guys haven't seen my damage testing on it already, essentially the summary is this: it does Acrius DPS but with significantly lower total damage, which I think for a weapon that is fairly easy to use is not insignificant, let's just say. So I put it in the C tier as like an easy damage option. Compared to stuff like Microcosm and Thunderlord, I think Prospector is definitely a cut above those exotics, even when it comes to just an easy DPS option. So pretty decent stuff from the Prospector. We have the Wardcliff Coil next. I've given it a tier bump. People are using it for Raniques. It is probably the best speedrun damage weapon for Raniques. So I was like, you know, bumping it up a tier just because of that, you know, viability. Even people that are not speedrunning use it on stuff like Warlock. So it's pretty decent. And yeah, that's why I've decided to move it up one tier. And then for our last two exotics that are not new exotics, we have Tractor Cannon. Tractor Cannon has dropped one tier from the S to the A tier. I think these days 30% debuff is not as meta defining or important with how prevalent Weaken is. We have Weaken on everything now, and our damage options are kind of so prevalent, so potent now, that having a specific tractor user is not as important, especially in lower than 6-man content compared to what it used to be. And so 6-man content only accounts for like maybe 2 or 3 columns out of the 6 in the exotic weapon analysis tab. And so I decided Tractor Cannon, you know, not as important as it used to be. And of course, even in solo content for like grapple melee stuff, people don't use Tractor as often as they used to as well. Okay, our last exotic here that is not going to be a new exotic that we're going to talk about is Witherhoard. Witherhoard, obviously, Lost Signal has come out. There is basically no reason to use Witherhoard anymore. Lost Signal released between the last time I updated this tier list and right now, and so yeah, I don't think anyone is surprised. That was kind of the death knell for Witherhoard. It is down in the F tier because there's absolutely no reason to use this exotic outside of maybe sticking a boss or Envious Arsenal swaps, but even then, that's kind of just because you're lazy and there are better options than Witherhoard for that. Okay, finally, we have 3 new exotics, which I am glad to welcome into several different tiers here. First, we have Alethonym. Alethonym I could place higher here. I don't know if Bungie is going to patch sticking immune targets with your friends and just farming ammo off of them. If they don't patch this, maybe I'll move it up into the B tier, but even ammo farming is maybe not as relevant as people would like to believe. It is a new mechanic, I suppose, in Destiny that is maybe a little novel and people are kind of excited about it, but in terms of endgame viability, there are rarely any instances in this game where that is really worth doing outside of maybe, you know, contest mode or like maybe master challenges or something where people aren't pulling their weight when it comes to damage. However, it is nice for vertical movement like a primary ammo mountaintop. For example, if you're Lumina grappling in a speedrun and you need to swap to some sort of vertical movement boost, then you know, you can swap to Alethonym instead of mountaintop, and because you will have primary ammo and you won't have any special ammo, Alethonym will work. So that's kind of useful in speedrunning as well. But for the most part, I think it's fine being in the C tier for now. If Bungie decide not to patch the whole immune sticking thing, then maybe I'll put it in the B tier, but I think C tier is a fine placement. Even if they don't decide to patch it, I think it's like totally fine being in the C tier. Next up, we have Choir of One. Choir of One, even after it's nerfed, it has great burst on majors and stuff like GMs. It's still usable in speedrunning in some cases as well, and it's very, very ammo efficient compared to something like Fourth Horseman. It's versatile. It has kind of exotic catalyst / perk access. So yeah, Choir of One, just a very versatile weapon, and surprisingly still decently ammo efficient even if you don't run reserves. So 200 ammo is kind of enough to do its thing in a lot of content. So I think I was maybe a little overcritical of how much the reserve nerf was going to affect it. It still feels decent in a lot of content. That being said, it's not like meta defining or anything like that, so I decided to put it in the A tier. And finally, our last new exotic, Icebreaker. I know a lot of people are kind of in love with this exotic right now because of how it worked with stasis builds, but when it comes to optimal endgame play, which is kind of what this spreadsheet's all about, I do think it is a little gimmicky and not particularly strong for general play. I will be testing its viability in damage rotations as a swap option, as it is the first, what is it, like 49 RPM sniper. So pretty interesting stuff, and we can definitely bypass its RPM limitations by using it as a swap weapon with, you know, a big like 10 sized mag. So I'm pretty interested to see how it works out, and I'll definitely give it a try and I'll let you guys know what I think. But for now, I'm going to place it in the D tier. It's really not proven itself to be worthy of being in the C tier with stuff like Acrius and Lumina, if we're being honest with ourselves. So yeah, that's pretty much it for Icebreaker. So my final note to you guys will be something about the top of the tier list here. And you'll notice that this season there is no S tier. And this is kind of just a statement from me about the meta here. And I don't really think right now there are any exotic weapons that actually shape and define the meta themselves. We have a lot of exotic weapons. They're there maybe to supplement like exotic class item builds, or maybe they're to supplement your DPS, but there's nothing like, you know, year 5 galley, right? Year 5 galley, you would build entire damage strategies, you would build entire ad clear strategies, you would build day 1 strategies out of galley, behind galley. And, you know, we just don't have an exotic weapon, in my opinion, right now that is so fundamental and so optimal that it defines the meta itself. And I think you'll understand what I mean when we actually look at the stuff in the A tier. We have 6 A tier candidates here that could all maybe potentially be an S tier, but when we look at them, Buried Bloodline, it kind of just exists to supplement a build. It doesn't actually shape or define the meta on its own. Choir 1 is basically just a versatile exotic special weapon. Ergo is just good for ad clear and potentially for boss damage, but it's not meta defining on its own. Parasite is kind of just a good roam content option, a good DPS option, but it doesn't really feel like an exotic meta defining weapon in the same way that something like a year 5 galley once was. So that's why there's really no S tier this season. And I think the more and more you look at exotic weapons and kind of try to wrap your head around how they fit into endgame content, I think maybe you'll come to agree with me that there's no exotic weapon right now that really feels like it's taking the meta by storm and leading the meta in a specific direction. They're all just there to serve the meta that already exists, or to supplement builds that are making use of them by making them just a little bit better. So that's it for the exotic weapon tier list. I will be farming trials for the rest of this weekend to get that Envious Bait bipod tomorrow's answer, and hopefully when I get it, we will do some crazy damage testing. I really hate damage testing because, well, I don't hate damage testing, but I really hate getting into damage testing because there's a ton of weapon rolls that I have to chase at the start of every season, and until I get them, I can't do my damage testing. And so I can't make a video or, you know, do any damage testing until I have all these weapons, and getting the weapons requires me to like grind and stuff. So yeah, we'll get through it eventually. But yeah, for now, I'll leave you with this. If you have any comments, questions, concerns about this tier list, feel free to let me know. Maybe some things need to be placed higher, lower, but I do feel that we are getting closer to perfection when it comes to this tier list, along with the last perk/origin trade tier list that I made. And so hopefully in future seasons, these videos will be way shorter, and I'll be able to condense them and make them within the span of a shorter period of time. So goodbye for now, and I hope you enjoyed.